view. And I sat down to do it one day, just playing around with, well, how am I going to get this information out? Maybe it's going to all be weird if it's being relayed to Rusty by his lawyer. And maybe I should see what it's like to write from the prosecutor's point of view.
It's fascinating the way the characters have changed in the 22 years. Rusty has changed, of course. But Tommy Molto, for example, in the first was a jerk, a total jerk.
As Rusty described him, a pygmy in his soul.
That's right. But in Innocent, I found myself in some kind of sympathy with him. Because initially he wants to hold back. He doesn't want to go after Rusty. And it's the other guy, Brand, who's pushing it. And he almost became sympathetic, which I never thought would happen from the first novel.
Yeah, Tommy Molto has indisputably grown to be a decent man. And that's supposed, of course, to be a surprise to readers. And you know, this novel at its core is about change and about why some people repeat the same mistakes and why some other people manage to grow and lead richer lives. And Tommy clearly is in the second category.
How has Rusty changed in 22 years? And if you obviously know how he has changed, was it easier to write about him now than it was 20-odd years ago?
Well, I had a very clear sense of who he had become. Now, part of that was, I've never done this before, but you know, I'm asked to write this novella. I've never written fiction on assignment. I will never do it again. But I was basically sort of, you know, chumming the waters for this novel. And one of the things that I started to think about there when I described him as aloof and officious in the eyes of his colleagues was, what would it really be like to have the law as an institution be as important to you as it is to Rusty Savage and, frankly, to me, and have it turn its back on you in the way it had and still lead this life committed to it. And I saw him as somebody who'd been deeply traumatized by having been accused of this murder and has spent his life trying to recover. Throughout Presumed Innocent, Rusty Savage says, I want the life I had before. And that's one of the impulses that's led him back into his marriage. It's also led him back into the law, and he spent the 22 years sort of engaged in this single-minded reconstruction of the life that he otherwise thought he was entitled to have, which is about to culminate in his election to the state Supreme Court, and as so often happens with so many human beings, seeing what has been the life's project of 2 decades within reach, he suddenly realizes it's not going to make me happy.
Well, it's interesting. You use the phrase, you say that Rusty is yearning for an unnameable piece of happiness. He couldn't name it. Can you?
Oh, yeah. I think Rusty Savage made a fundamental mistake in saying, I want the life I had before, and was unwilling to grapple with the fact that, you know, his life had to change.
Don't we all want that, though, really, in a sense?
We all want
the life we had before, either teenagers or young or whatever.
You know, I mean, this gets onto tender ground, but I saw Rusty Savage as being like a lot of people who, for inner reasons, had clung to a very bad marriage. And, you know, and that's a sad thing that happens all the time. And whatever it is in him, and some of it is a very high-minded morality that saw the events of Presumed Innocent as having been set in motion by himself, but that high-minded morality also goes to conceal a quite self-punitive nature, something he has in common with his nemesis, Tommy Molto. And, you know, a lot of what happens to Rusty is a result of his unwillingness to really try to know himself. He's reflective, but he won't ask himself the hardest questions.
I get the feeling in both novels that his emotional underpinnings are they're very shaky. Mm-hmm. They can go like that at some point, and he's constantly in a state of almost beating himself up.
Yeah, he's a guy who's always deeply agitated, but clearly much more so in the time frame of Innocent than for, I think, the years before, where he thought he knew what he was doing. He had made a rather large compromise and stayed in this marriage in part for the sake of a son whom he adores, so that, you know, he and his wife and his only child could be living in the same household, so that he would not have failed as a father in the way his own miserable father had failed him.
The thing about your novels is that they are complex without being complicated. They're like the Russian nesting dolls, you know, with the little doll in front of you. How do you keep it all straight in your head?
I don't outline, you know, I just think. And
is your wall covered with little post-it notes? Or?
No, it's all in my head. Now, God knows what age is going to do to this capacity. And, you know, and there are moments where, kind of like my inability to remember a couple of your questions, I'll be sitting there and I'm going, why did this happen? Why did I think that had to happen? And sometimes it'll take me a full day to recover my own deep logic, because I will sit there and frankly think about what is in the novel in a way probably that almost no reader is going to do.
But you belong to the school of writers, and I've talked to a number of them who say, I never know what the character is going to do next. I've always found that a little strange, actually.
Well, I mean, you know, I see, I mean, I have fundamentally a Freudian outlook on life. I believe in the unconscious. Mm-hmm. I believe that that force that leads us to dream every night doesn't just go away. And I see writing a novel, for example, as being deeply related to the dreaming process.
Really?
It's why I think it's easier for me to write in the morning when the dust of dreams has not been fully shaken off than it is later at night. And for me, it's a weird mix of intense concentration to sort of make sure the plot is rational and connected. And it's very lawyerly and precise in the way I think about it. And yet, my response to the characters is almost entirely visceral. I just know that it's right. That's the way, you know, this person, this man, this woman would behave. And and I think in that I'm like a lot of writers. So if you're being somewhat unconscious in your writing, of course you're going to be surprised by your characters. That doesn't mean that I ever thought that, well, I'm going to take this. I was about to say I didn't think Rusty Savage was ever going to be sworn in as a justice of the Supreme Court, but for example, did I know absolutely when I sat down to write this book very quickly that he was going to make many of the same mistakes he'd made before in his life? Yes, I knew that. So I wasn't shocked when that happened with Rusty Savage. When Tommy Molto turned out to be as decent a man as he is, yeah, that was a surprise. That was a surprise.